and welcome everybody to the 5th, what am I thinking? The 5th COVID-19 Robots and Us. I'm looking forward to the future. And in fact, if there's any theme for today, it's actually looking forward into the future because, you know, if we just talk about what's happening now, then we talk a lot about shutdowns and it can be a little stressful and depressing. So a lot of the companies and people that we're talking to today are also going to be sharing stories about what's working for them, what's working well. And, you know, I'm hoping that we can take some pointers towards the future as what robotics is going to not just survive, but thrive in a post-COVID world. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first guest today is Melonee Wise, who is the CEO of Fetch Robotics. And Fetch is still, by all accounts, I would say a very young company, and yet it has grown incredibly since you started. Tell us about that, Melonee.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so Fetch is 5 years old. Well, I guess almost 6. We'll be 6 in August. We have about 140 employees. And you know, 5 years ago, I think the big thing that when you look back on 5 years, it's that the industry was very immature and the idea of mobile robots was still very new and a lot of there was a lot of misunderstanding about the technology, what it was capable of. And it's come a long way. I think that, you know, the first 3 years of my journey with Fetch was a lot of missionary work, let's call it, in getting the word out and explaining how this technology works and its value and the value that it can provide to the end user. Um, and I think it's becoming more normalized. I think that people are starting to buy in more and more to the technology. Uh, I think that COVID has definitely accelerated that understanding or that need for automation, specifically around flexible automation. I think if you look at the customers that we have that have had to increase their operations during this time, a lot of them have been relying very heavily on the flexibility of the platform in terms of dealing with their schedule changes. So we've had customers have to move from 1 or 2 shifts to 4 shifts so that they can increase social distancing within the facility, but then also provide large cleaning periods. Um, so some of our customers are running a like 2-6 or even a 2-5 kind of operation where they spend 2 hours cleaning the facility in between work periods so that they can keep the place staffed. And so making it possible for the robots to deal with that scheduling change very rapidly. I mean, we invested a lot in usability and giving our customers the power to change those things. But the other thing that we're seeing is just enabling social distancing. Like another thing that a lot of the companies did is they immediately changed all the workflows that the robots were doing. So they, instead of the robots just doing all the long hauls, now they're going like in between stations to deliver material and things like that, so people don't do that delivery. But I don't know. It's been a journey, and some of the bets that we've made have paid off pretty significantly. I mean, we took a big risk about 3.5 years ago by going all cloud. So we don't do anything on prem, and we had to walk away from probably 20% of our inbound at the time of that decision to basically focus on that, because there were about 20% of the people who were coming to us said we could never do the cloud. I would say we've got about 15% captured, or like that's, I guess, 80% of that 20% recaptured from I mean, they walked away 3 years ago, but now they're back. But it was a hard thing to talk to the sales team at the time and say, we're only going to do cloud. Ignore what the customer believes about on-premise.
This would be a great time. Bo, can you show the clip of the Fetch Robotics at Work, because it will just illustrate a little bit about what you mean, just in making that transition, for example, from doing long haul trips into doing rapid trips. And you were saying that at this point in time, it's the fact that you're doing this on cloud and not having to send anybody into the factories that has turned out to be such a huge positive feature for everyone. That and the
Yeah.
flexibility.
Yeah, I mean, the big things, the big bets that we made 3.5 years ago, 4 years ago, as we were just getting the product into the market, were around usability, the cloud, ease of deployment, and you know, it definitely is distracting to spend a lot of time on things like usability when it doesn't provide new robot features. But it's really paying off right now when you look at it in the grand scheme of things, because with COVID we can't go on site, so we're deploying robots over Skype, which is interesting. You know, because there's no need for on-premise, computer software or things like that. We don't have to set up servers, so all of that is done over there. All the support is remote. So, but it really it required an investment on our part to make the software very usable, and so everything's done through a web browser. Everything's click and drag, and I can tell you, like, it was a big bet, and it was definitely questioned by our board potentially around, like, does this make sense to focus on these aspects of the technology as opposed to other ones, and the bets have paid off so far. But I think that there are other ways that people are approaching the problem in the market. Some companies are making very highly integrated, specialized solutions, and that take several weeks to deploy and things like that. And so there are trade-offs in terms of how you approach the problem. And I think in this time of where people are thinking about flexibility and supply chain contingency and things like that, some of the bets we've made are really becoming shining gems. But I think they were definitely highlights when going into the market and talking to customers about the technology and its capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
But they've become even more important because people are really understanding how these kind of events can impact their supply chain continuity.
So you're not only flexible, but you're remote operated. And I've been seeing more startups developing things like dashboard systems for fleet management, for cloud control. And
Yeah.
it seems to me that this is going to be a really important aspect of the rollout of robotics moving forwards. Certainly people are a lot more aware of that. I would say also the flexibility that you're saying you're able to change how your robots are deployed rapidly without having to physically go in and make changes is also not to be understated.
Yeah, I would say one thing is I think that one of the challenges that a lot of these companies that are making robot diagnostic tool sets for, especially cloud-based ones, is they have some challenges, I think, ahead of them, because there's a lot of great open source tools that are coming up. Like Cruise open sourcing WebViz was like a big thing. It's a great tool, and but it basically they open source splashed like right into the economic bed of a whole bunch of DevOps for robots companies. But I think that the dev for robots companies, I think the biggest thing that they need to work on is how do they make it as easy to allow people to customize the DevOps backend as possible, because Fetch had to build all of that up from scratch. And a lot of the things that when I look at the DevOps backend that we built compared to some of the teams that are making these really, really nice backend DevOps tools for robot companies, is they're not very vertical centric. And I think that's going to be one of the big challenges that some of these DevOps companies run into, is they are providing DevOps backends for robotics companies, is being able to allow the robotics companies that they're servicing to tailor their backends for the vertical markets they're servicing. And so, you know, because several of those companies have approached me, and I said, well, one, Fetch, you know, had to build all this from scratch from the beginning. We're not gonna. I mean, we've already invested the DevOps work, right? We're not going to switch to another platform. But then I showed them kind of our tool set and how it compares to their tool set, and there's definitely things that we've built in our backend that are very specific to the type of customer we service in supply chain, right? And I think, you know, it's interesting because, like, you know, Diligent has built their system on top of Fetch's, and they have their own like kind of wrapper around our Fetch core system to basically provide their interface for hospitals, for example. And it makes sense because we're servicing logistics and supply chain customers, and you would never want to throw that in front of a doctor or a nurse or a hospital, you know, supply chain manager or something like that.
So that's Diligent Robotics with Moxie.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm
They're
hoping to
robots
get
based
them
on
on
us.
the. Yeah, I'm hoping to have them on the call sometime soon.
Yeah.
It certainly would love to learn more about that, but that makes a lot of sense. And I'm thinking at the moment, and I don't know if we're ever going to get to a general purpose platform, although that's promising what you said about um, the Fetch robots being used as a base for other application areas, because it really seems like out of the 80-20 split, that 20 bit of difference is where 80% of the value is, being able to provide a solution for a specific industry problem.
Yeah, and I think Diligent did something pretty clever in the way that they overlaid their system on ours, so that they could still leverage all of the base navigation and stuff, but then they overlaid some of the kind of social interaction stuff that we really don't have in our system, because we don't really care about the social interaction as much, because we're kind of doing point to point. We don't have to do a lot of interpersonal interaction the way their, you know, nurse assistant is. And so I thought what the way that they did it was very clever by having, you know, a secondary system that's kind of overlaying their heuristics on top of ours. And I thought it was well done.
Now, that's very interesting. Yes, your human-robot interaction is going to be much more implicit, and that comes to the heart of the difference between the AGVs and the AMRs, as we were talking about the, never sure I get that, the guided vehicles, as
Yeah,
opposed to
guided.
the autonomous mobile robots, because you might have a logistics robot in your facility, but if it's an AGV, then it's got physical infrastructure determining where it goes, and so it's not flexible, period. So we're only just seeing this decade, I think, the real rollout of AMRs like Fetch Robotics into workplaces. So that's probably a real challenge, because superficially AGVs and AMRs look very, very similar, but the
Yeah.
scope is incredibly different.
Yeah, and so I'm on R1508, the standards committee for the new AMR standard. One of the big distinction we help make for the difference between AGVs and AMRs is really around the usage and the difference between collision avoidance and um, and obstacle avoidance. So collision avoidance is with the intent to stop because you're about to have a collision. And typically the only thing that system does is stop. It's a sensor-based system that is designed to bring the system to a hard stop. Whereas obstacle avoidance is really around, you know, detecting, sensing, you know, sensing, thinking, acting. And typically the types of sensors that are used on those platforms are very different, but those are the two major differences. And we did this because the problem is that the way that the standards address AGVs, the AGVs really, because they're on a planned path, you can actually do a risk assessment or a safety inspection of that entire path and say, like, as long as the robot stays on this path, it will be safe. There's no overhanging things, there's nothing, you know. But when you look at an AMR, because it has no guide path, it is free form flowing through the environment. And so if the environment could have overhanging things, then the system has to have sensing commensurate for it. And that's one of the things that, like, the AGV standard B56.5 doesn't make allowance for. It basically says that you have to have a clear area above the robot for, I think, 2 meters. Um, and so there's no affordance in the standard for those types of things. And I think that's one of the hardest things that we have to explain to customers when talking about AMRs, is that the AMR is only as safe as the sensing capability it has. The vehicle, whether it's an AGV or an AMR or whatever, it's only as safe as the sensing capability it has. And that's true for all I guess vehicle systems that interact with people or interact with cars. I mean, you know, we've seen several very famous accidents today with autonomous vehicles that basically prove that the system is only as safe as the sensing capabilities. For example, you know, do RGB cameras have the depth fidelity and contrast fidelity to see, you know, pedestrians walking across the street at night? Most people would say no. Most roboticists would definitely say no. And so you probably want to be using a hard sensor technology that's using some form of infrared light to get an exact precise measurement of the object in time of flight kind of ways. And so you can only make the system as safe as those sensors. And then I think one of the things that we have to deal with a lot more than the automotive industry, especially in logistics and supply chain, is we're far more regulated. OSHA and a lot of other agencies. Autonomous vehicles don't have accidents; they have collisions. Well, we can talk about that. I think that when you look at the logistics and supply chain industry, it's heavily regulated, and so you have to do an assessment of whether the device has the potential to kill someone or not, and then you have to provide safety systems commensurate with that risk. And so, for example, our large robots, which are as big as cars, have to have PLD rated safety systems in them, as opposed to an autonomous car that has no such requirement. And so there's very big differences between the way the two industries are regulated and the way that people perceive risk. And autonomous vehicles don't have maybe per se accidents, but you can force an autonomous vehicle into a situation that is not its fault by jumping out in front of it. And so I think it's important to say that all risk and all risk assessment assumes that in the environment where you're assessing risk, people are acting rationally and behaving rationally. And so there are situations in which you can force autonomous systems to make critical errors that basically violate the principles of risk assessment, such as jumping out in front of a car at the last second. So you can say that vehicles can have accidents. It's just that they functioned properly. For example, an autonomous car that at the last second sees someone and brakes, that's proper functionality. It's just that time and mass and physics weren't on your side. So I think that, but I do think that we do have to look at the maturity of these systems, but we also have to look at the maturity of our regulation and the way we're bringing these systems to market. I think that in the AMR industry, we're heavily focused on safety because the customers and the legislation and the regulation are driving us towards it. And liability is a lot different in our environment. It's not the same in the automotive industry. It's not the same in these other segments. And so it's kind of like two different worlds. And it's one of the biggest misunderstandings that I struggle with when talking to investors, because they say things to me like, oh, well, why do you care about this safety stuff? Like autonomous cars just put cars on the road. And it's like, well, you can only do what your industry will bear, and our industry is full of regulation.
In fact, next week, we're going to focus a little bit more on risks and regulations. We had people raising the issue of privacy. We also had a great talk from Missy Cummings last week about rethinking the maturity of artificial intelligence in safety critical settings. So we'll dive more deeply into that next week. So that was a really good prep for that, in fact. Now, I'm going to call on Eric to tell us. Eric Bennett is the CEO of Frontier Bio and was also involved recently in a Center for Emerging and Underserved Diseases COVID hackathon.
Emerging diseases.
Emerging.
Center for Emerging and Neglected Diseases. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So they hosted a hackathon. It had to be a virtual hackathon because of the situation, of course. And it was sponsored by the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation, I believe, or the BioHub. And so actually, first I'll explain a little bit about my company. So we are Frontier Bio. We make an advanced 3D bioprinter for printing human tissue. And actually, I think I'll share my screen so you can see a quick little video, and then I can show you the ventilator design. So let's see here. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so this is just a very quick video that I'll show. This is the bioprinter. This is the first version of our bioprinter, but basically it combines multiple methods of bioprinting into one machine for the purposes of bioprinting, printing living tissue. And so towards the end of this video, actually, so right here is showing the printing of a porous scaffold for an ear, and we sold this to a customer. Right here we have a flexible blood vessel model, and the Mayo Clinic is actually using our nanofiber print heads for creating these nanofibrous blood vessel scaffolds. And so what they do is you can see well, it might be hard to see, but you can see a cloud of nanofibers coming off, landing onto this rod, and then they can take it off and seed it with endothelial cells. And then it'll mature into a blood vessel after 2 or 3 weeks, a blood vessel analog. So, but it has actual human endothelial cells, and they can use this for their research purposes. So that's what we do. And the reason I bring that up is because bioprinting has applications in for COVID. So for instance, printing of lung tissues is important for creating these in vitro models, lung models for testing drugs. So you can think of it as like a lung on a chip or a bioprinted lung in a dish, and it can be used for discovering drugs. So drug companies can test a bunch of different drugs on this lung model tissue and see what has an effect on the virus, for instance, or they can study the way the virus enters the system or other things like that. So that's how bioprinting relates to COVID. So anyway, I was invited to the hackathon. It was a 24-hour hackathon, and it was virtual, so it had to be just a high-level thing. We weren't able to develop a prototype, but basically we figured out how ventilators work. We spoke with doctors to figure out what the biggest needs are and what features are necessary, and we designed this very basic ventilator. So in the world, this is the opening slide. So the world was facing a big ventilator shortage, obviously from the pandemic. And so what we proposed was just a very simple ventilator that can be quickly made and is easily deployable. And so we went over some background information, but there are 4 basic things necessary for the ventilator. That would be controlling the breathing rate, the tidal volume, and the percent oxygen, as well as something called the PEEP, which is the positive and expiratory pressure. And so these were the most important options. You've probably seen some open source ventilator designs where it's an ambulatory bag where they just an arm squeezes it and just pushes air in. But those designs don't have oxygen. And so our design was allowed for the doctor to connect just a tube that goes to a tank of oxygen, and so that they can control the percent oxygen content. And so this is the high level diagram. You've got the air pump, you got the oxygen, it's going to the patient. We've got some valves and pressure sensors, and we describe how it would work. And so since then, well, the price was under $500. And then since then, we were trying to get some funding to actually try to prototype it and test it and iterate. We were unsuccessful in getting some funding, but we have been talking with, or I've been speaking with a company called, well, they're not a company, a group called Respira Works. And so this is they had their design, and it was similar to ours. And so we're kind of combining efforts now. Well, they're much, much further ahead compared to us because they actually did have a working prototype, and I can show you what it looks like. Here's some very early videos. Can you see this?
Yes.
Can you hear it?
Yes.
Okay, it's pretty loud. But yeah, you can see, maybe I'll mute it because it's very loud. But yeah, you can see the blower here. It's taking in air. The computer here is just monitoring the air pressure and the flow rate and other factors here. And so they actually do have a prototype here, and they're very far along, and they're just doing adding more and more features, making it more robust, and making custom PCB designs for it currently. And so I'm talking with some Berkeley doctors to hopefully connect with them and apply for a grant for funding this and doing a clinical design, clinical study, basically. And so this group is actually already talking with a nonprofit hospital in Guatemala. And so they currently have fewer than 500 ventilators. And so the design would really help out. Earlier, I think yesterday it said 300, and they got a donation of 200. And so, but yeah, if that's not enough, then they definitely need this this new ventilator. So
Well,
yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you, Eric. It certainly shows how you can make an impact with these projects, because we're often blinded by the thought of, oh, isn't it great? We're flattening the curve in California, but it's still a global issue. And we're hearing that this is a problem that's probably going to be here for 1 to 2 years, with surges continuing to happen. So there's plenty of time for new designs to reach the market. Now, one of the problems, I've talked to a few companies that were building new designs for ventilators, and they were having trouble sourcing the parts, specialist valves and condensers and other things like that. Were you able to avoid designing in potential supply chain issues?
So that was a problem with us. We wanted to make sure that we wanted to get that so that there was no problems. We struggled with that, and Respira Works is still looking into that too. Yeah, there's kind of an issue right now. Yeah.
And I think you were helped along as Festo, who's a Silicon Valley Robotics member, sent some engineers to be mentors for the Send Hackathon as well. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that.
That's right. Yeah. So Festo, we were in touch with them regarding selection of valves and selection of flow sensors and tubing and things like that. And so they helped us figure out, you know, how much this would cost, or just selection of the appropriate device. Yep.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much for sharing that, Eric. Now we'll talk a little bit more about the potential implications to privacy and to safety of going a little bit too far, perhaps, in some of these directions. You know, when is this a viable use of the technology? When is this an essential use of the technology for the public? And when is that actually, but is it being well safeguarded, or is this placing public-private information at risk? And Ken, I see you there, and also Tom, you've just joined. Ken, do you have any comments? And Tom, I've put you online if you would like to talk as well.
Sure. Well, I'd like to let Tom speak a little bit, but I just wanted to mention one new thing that's come up, which is that there's a testing lab that is opening at Berkeley that is gearing up for very high capacity. And one of the things that they discovered just literally yesterday was that there was a shortage of these nasal pharyngeal swabs. These are the thing that they stick in your nose, up your nose, and they have to go very far deep into the back of your nasal cavity to take a sample. I don't know if anyone online has had the pleasure of that test. Apparently quite unpleasant. And actually, there's a lot of issues about getting these swabs manufactured just the right way. So there's a shortage. They're down to 50, and they need 50,000. And so there's been a number of exchanges about groups that are trying to 3D print them, et cetera. But as you can imagine, it's a big issue because the material has to be biologically safe. The whole thing has to be sterilized. You have to make sure that there's a swab on the end that that doesn't come loose. Because if you put it in and there's some friction in there and you pull it out and it's stuck inside your body, that's not good.
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a whole, and there's a number of little nuances to it. So we just started looking at this, and so the team is investigating, but then we started thinking what else could be done. So to your point, Andra, about innovation, one of the things that we've been thinking is what other way is there to collect a specimen like this, right? Like, it seems that sticking something way up your nose into your cavity, I think that people are going to experience that once and decide they don't want to go back again. So they may not want to, this may inhibit testing, which is really a problem. And certainly nobody's going to want to do these tests every week. So what other options are there? Maybe there's something where, I could imagine something where you put something over and you cough into a collection unit that would collect enough material. That seems like much easier, much less invasive, and easier to produce. I heard that there was a group that is analyzing the sound of the cough to have a look at the signal of a cough and be able to predict and classify that as whether it's a dry cough of a particular type that's very common in COVID-19.
I did see that. That was the group that I think had done some research on babies crying and detecting a particular illness based on the cry frequency. I can have a look and post that information, but yeah, that's a really amazing thought that you can switch from something that's really physically intrusive and potentially dangerous to something that is much easier.
Yeah, and so imagine that something would be a pretest that would just listen to, you do a cough on a regular basis, right? You need a baseline. So you just cough, you know, like that when you feel well, and it would record that. But then on a day when you don't feel so well, it would record that cough and then compare that in some way to say, well, that's a wet cough, it's probably not COVID-19, or that's a particular dry cough, it fits in the category of what we've seen before. So, but that wouldn't be the conclusive test. Then you'd have to go in and get the physical test. But is there ways to do that without sticking this thing way into your, you know, up your nose? So anyway, we're just thinking about this and where tools like signal processing could be helpful. And then the last thing I want to mention before I turn over to Tom is the idea, someone posted in IEEE Spectrum a really nice article talking about the return to starting to open things up, but as a control problem. In other words, it's not a binary. You flip the system on, everybody goes back to work, and then all of a sudden you flip it off because there's been another outbreak, and this gives rise to instabilities, which are classic, bang bang control, which would be very, very bad. So what you really want to do is have a controller that's tuned so it's looking for signals and just basically adjusting so that you have very small oscillations, so you can gradually allow reopening and then monitoring so that you can bring it down again as needed. So you're not looking at these massive overshoot, which is what we've experienced in the last month. So it's a really interesting article. I'll look it up while Tom's talking and post it on here.
That's great. So analog control would be more needed. That's fascinating.
Yeah, that just good old control theory is actually very helpful here.
2-week phase delay, though, is a little bit tough, though.
Of course. So you have to do predictive control, and modeling, and all the techniques that control theorists have been developing over the last half century.
So,
right, so Tom.
That was, yes, and that was Ken Goldberg, from the director of the CITRIS People and Robots Initiative. And now we're introducing Tom Lowe, who's the director of robotics at SRI International.
All right, thanks, Andra. And for those that aren't familiar with SRI, we're a Silicon Valley Research Institute. We're a nonprofit, not too far from Stanford University. I run the robotics lab there, and we're probably best known for our pioneering work in robotic surgery back 25, 30 years ago now. We're still pursuing that kind of remote surgical work, and part of what we're looking at now in response to COVID involves adaptation of some of that technology. But, like everyone else, we thought early on, oh, there's going to be a ventilator shortage. How can we contribute to the shortage of ventilators? I'm fortunate to be married to a recently retired ICU nurse. I'm glad she's not working in the unit anymore. But the first thing she said is, it's not the hardware that's going to be the problem. It's the skilled personnel. If you don't have respiratory therapists and nurses and doctors, it's such a high maintenance. Having a patient on a ventilator is such a high maintenance task. Typically, it's a 1-to-1 or a 2-to-1 ratio between ventilated patients and ICU nurses. So, we armed with that, we sort of backed away from the contributing to making lots of quick and dirty ventilators pretty early at SRI. We have been working in vital signs monitoring for some time, not for medical applications, but for other DoD interested applications. And so we've looked at repurposing some of our technology that measures heart rate, blood pressure, or excuse me, heart rate, respiration, O2 sat, things of that sort, for remote monitoring of patients that would be perhaps recuperating at home for indications that they're going south and being able to bring them into medical care earlier. There's an exemption that's in place now from the FDA allowing off-label uses of technology, but it turns out, as we learned, that it is only approved, FDA-approved devices that can be used in creative ways. If you have a device that you just built and it hasn't been FDA approved, you have a very, very long road. You still have to go through all the hoops. So, so that hasn't really led to anything in the near term for us. Talking more about applications of robotics and specifically telerobotics for delivering care in underserved areas. There's really a couple of things. One is reducing the number of patient-caregiver physical interactions. So there may be some things that can be done from outside of the room or even remotely, especially in areas that are underserved that don't have large staff for caring for a surge of patients. This is similar to work that we're doing now for the Department of Defense in robotic surgery, developing a small battery-powered Da Vinci, if you would. I don't want to imply that Intuitive Surgical is sponsoring this, but a small robotic surgery system that could be extra hands, extra pairs of hands, operated by skilled surgeons from elsewhere, and helping the surgeons that might be in a forward operating post, providing damage control to injured combatants. So in a similar vein, you're always going to need skilled nurses, respiratory therapists in the room with the patients to turn them to to suction them, to do those types of things. But when it comes to setting the ventilator, an expert that's remote, we believe may be able to do so not through an interface on the ventilator, because those don't exist. These FDA-approved devices don't have an Ethernet plug on the back that you plug into the network, because that opens up a huge security problem. But a robot can push buttons and turn knobs and be remotely operated. So there's one way that we can take expertise from an urban center and distribute it to perhaps rural areas that are just now coming into the surge. So in a nutshell, those are some of the kinds of ideas that my team and I have been pursuing.
That's fascinating. And indeed, I think, Ken, you've been talking as well about the need for us to dive more deeply into the opportunities with telemedicine. And I'm just thinking it's quite apt that you bring this up now, Tom, with what Melonee was talking about right at the start, where the new wave of autonomous mobile robots that's going out, in her instance with Fetch Robotics, that was able to be controlled online, was just a significant game changer. So are you working on prototypes for the teleoperated ventilators?
Oh, not for the ventilators, but for the robots that could operate the ventilators through the same interfaces as a human. And we believe that doing so would not in any way compromise their FDA approval, whereas adding an interface requires a fairly high regulatory bar.
Fascinating. That's a really smart approach to the solution. But of course, SRI built the first human robot way back in the 60s, amongst many other things. So I expect no less. Now, this has taken us almost to the 8 o'clock. I want to thank all of the speakers right now for just a fantastic talk. We were very, very diverse, but I do think a key thing was it was future facing. And so to hear about the initiatives from Eric and from Tom that are really going to have a huge impact on particularly, say, remote areas, lower developing countries, lower income areas, and really everyone in health who's not well serviced, and to start to see plans for the use of robots in very constructive and smart ways is just brilliant.
Actually, I'd just like to add to that, if I can, Andra, that I think there's a point that we may not be realizing as much, which is that the COVID-19 has had its greatest impact on the high density urban environments first, and that's natural because those are where there's a lot more exchange, more people are interacting in close quarters. So in the major cities. But we're slowly starting to see the impact spread out to more rural environments. And that's where those environments have pretty much been, or many of those have been fortunately spared. But I think that is a little bit of a false confidence that we're going to see that the virus may persist and may end up getting transmitted into those areas, especially as you've alluded earlier, the idea of antibodies, right? Antibodies that may have started to accumulate in urban areas, but they haven't in these rural areas, they haven't been exposed, and so they're vulnerable. And so we may see in the next few months these heightened outbreaks in more remote areas. And this is particularly problematic where there isn't access to the same kind of hospital care or medical care. And I'm thinking not only in rural America, but also all over the world. And so I think that we're thinking about this. How can we do remote diagnostics? How can doctors who have been very experienced, let's say in a major metropolitan area, then apply their expertise to a remote area that has seen very few cases? So I think this idea of telemedicine, using these tools that we've been talking about, are actually going to be more important in the future. And what you're hearing is the howl at 8 p.m.
It's
here.
the 8 p.m. howl.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay.
Good day.
Well, it's great to be able to join in on the 8 p.m. howl, and that was a wonderful finishing note. So thank you all very much.